4,000 people packed the grandstands at the Shelby County Fairgrounds that Saturday in July of 2019, and every single one of them had an opinion about the woman standing next to the rust-colored Peterbilt 359 in Lane 1. Most of those opinions were wrong. Her name was Maren Cade Dawson. She was 31 years old. She weighed about 130 pounds in her cowboy boots, and she had just registered a 1974 Peterbilt 359 with a factory original Cummins NTC 350 engine and motor that had rolled off the assembly line in Columbus, Indiana, 45 years earlier into the Superstock class of the Shelby County big rig pull against trucks that cost more than most houses in that county. The registration fee was $200. The man at the table looked at the truck, looked at her, looked back at the truck, and asked if she was sure. She was sure. Now across from her, sitting in lane 2, like something that had been born inside a wind tunnel, was a machine that barely qualified as a truck anymore. A 2018 body on a tube frame chassis, Aerotech livery running down both sides in black and electric pink nitro, and kinetic decals on every surface that was not already covered in sponsor money. The driver was a 23-year-old named Colby Griggs. Colby had been pulling competitively since he was 17. He had a fire suit. He had a crew of 4. He had a turbocharger the size of a watermelon bolted to an engine that was making somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,200 horsepower on methanol. His truck all in was worth about $185,000. Maren's Peterbilt, if you went by what a dealer would give her for it, was worth maybe $4,000. Maybe. And if you were standing in those grandstands that afternoon, if you were holding a corn dog and a Pepsi and looking down at that dirt track, you would have seen exactly what everyone else saw. A joke. A rust bucket big rig with patina so thick it looked like it had been dragged out of a river, parked next to a purpose-built pulling machine that had won 11 events in 2 states that season alone. You would have laughed. You would have elbowed the person sitting next to you and pointed. You would have pulled out your phone to record what you assumed was about to be an embarrassment. But here is what nobody standing in that crowd knew. And before I tell you what happened on that track, I need to take you somewhere else first. Somewhere 16 years earlier. Because the story of that Peterbilt did not start in Shelby County. It did not start in a barn. It started in a yard full of people eating potato salad and trying not to cry on the worst day of Maren Dawson's life. Let me tell you about Clayton Dawson, because a man like this deserves to be told about properly. Clayton Dawson drove trucks for a living. Long haul, mostly grain and livestock out of Louisville down to Memphis and back 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, for the better part of 3 decades. He was not a man who talked about himself. He was a man who showed up. He showed up when the roads were bad. He showed up when the pay was late. He showed up when his back hurt so badly that he had to grip the steering wheel with both hands just to pull himself up into the cab. And he never once called in sick, because calling in sick was not something Clayton Dawson believed in. He owned 3 trucks over his lifetime. The first was a Cab-Over International he bought, used in 1962 with money he had saved working tobacco since he was 14. It had a 4-speed manual and a cab that leaked when it rained and a heater that only worked when you were going uphill. He drove that truck for 11 years. The second was a Kenworth W900 that he bought in 1973. A proper long-nose conventional with a sleeper cab and a Jake brake, and enough chrome on the bumper to blind you on a sunny day. He drove the Kenworth through the 70s and into the early 80s until the transmission gave out on a hill outside Bowling Green, and he coasted it to the shoulder and sat there for an hour before the tow truck came. He was not angry. He was tired. Tired in the way that men get tired when a machine they have trusted with their livelihood finally decides it has given everything it has. The third truck was the 1974 Peterbilt 359, Cummins NTC 350 engine, 13-speed Road Ranger transmission. He bought it from a fleet liquidation sale in Jeffersonville in the spring of 1974 for $11,000, which was every dollar he had, plus $2,000 he borrowed from his brother-in-law and paid back in 8 months, driving double loads through the summer heat. That Peterbilt was by any measure the finest thing Clayton Dawson ever owned, finer than his house, finer than his land. He washed it on Sundays after church, standing in the gravel driveway with a bucket of soapy water and a chamois cloth working the chrome until it reflected the sky. He changed the oil every 6,000 miles without exception. He kept a logbook in the glove box where he recorded every repair, every fluid change, every odd sound the engine made in handwriting so small and neat it looked like it had been typeset by a machine. Clayton drove that truck until 1996 when his knees gave out and the doctor told him he could either stop climbing in and out of a cab or he could stop walking altogether, and Clayton chose walking. He parked the Peterbilt behind the tobacco barn on the 37 acres of Breckinridge County land his family had owned since 1931, and he told everyone he would get back to it. He said it the way men say things they want to believe. He said it every spring for 7 years. He did not get back to it. Clayton Dawson died in the fall of 2003. Heart gave out on a Tuesday morning while he was sitting on the porch drinking coffee and looking out at the field where nothing grew anymore because nobody had planted it in years. He was 78 years old. He died the way he had lived, which is to say quietly, without asking anyone for anything, in a chair he had built himself from oak he had cut from his own land. The coffee cup was still warm when Maren's mother found him. Maren was 15 when her grandfather died. She was the only grandchild who cared about the truck. She had ridden in it as a little girl sitting on a phone book on the passenger seat because she was too small to see out the windshield, otherwise watching Clayton work the gears on the Road Ranger with a hand that never rushed and never hesitated. She knew the sound of that Cummins engine the way other children knew the sound of their mother's voice. It was the sound of safety, the sound of motion, the sound of being with someone who never made her feel like she was in the way. Her brother, 2 years older, wanted to scrap the truck, said he knew a guy in Brandenburg who would give them $800 for the metal. Her mother wanted the barn space cleared so she could store hay for a neighbor's horses. But it was her father's reaction that mattered most, and I need you to understand what happened next, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Virgil Dawson was Clayton's only son. He had grown up watching his father drive trucks and had decided early on that he wanted no part of it. Virgil worked at a limestone quarry outside Hardinsburg. He drove a company pickup. He had good benefits and a steady paycheck, and he considered himself a practical man, which in Virgil's case meant a man who looked at the world and sorted everything into 2 categories: useful and not useful, and anything that fell into the second category was not worth his time or his attention or his emotional energy. It was an efficient way to live. It was also, if you happened to be his daughter, a lonely one. The funeral was on a Thursday. Afterward, the family gathered in the yard the way families do in that part of the country, standing around in small groups with plates of food they were not really eating, talking about things that did not matter, because the thing that mattered was too large to talk about directly. Maren's aunt had set up folding tables under the maple tree. Casserole dishes and cornbread and a coconut cake that nobody had touched. Maren's uncle was leaning against his truck with a can of beer he was trying to make last. The air smelled like cut grass and the last of the summer heat, and something else. Something that Maren did not have a name for, but that she would later recognize as the smell of a family rearranging itself around an absence. Maren, 15 years old, still wearing the black dress her mother had bought her at the Walmart in Elizabethtown 2 days earlier, walked up to her father and said the only thing she had been thinking about since the moment she found out her grandfather was gone. She said she wanted to keep the truck. She did not say it quietly. She said it standing in the yard with 8 or 9 relatives within earshot, because she was 15, and 15-year-olds do not yet know that some things are safer said in private. And Virgil Dawson looked at his daughter, and he did not look angry, and he did not look sad. He looked like a man who had just been told something so foolish that it did not deserve a serious response. Sell the thing, Maren. You do not know what you are looking at. He said it with a small laugh, not a cruel laugh, not even a dismissive laugh, something worse. An amused laugh, the laugh of a man who has already made up his mind and considers the conversation a formality. And around the yard, Maren watched the adults react the way adults react when the patriarch speaks. Her uncle nodded slowly as if Virgil had said something wise. Her brother smiled the way older brothers smile when their younger sister is about to learn something the hard way. Her aunt turned away and started collecting plates, which in that family was the same as casting a vote. Not a single person in that yard stood with Maren. Not one. Have you ever been 15 years old and said something true to a room full of people who should have believed you and watched every one of them look away? Have you ever felt the ground shift under you? Not because you were wrong, but because being right did not matter when nobody was willing to stand with you. Maren looked at her father. She looked at the barn behind him, where the Peterbilt sat with its hood facing east, the same direction it had always faced, the same direction Clayton had always parked it, because the morning sun would warm the engine block and make it easier to start on cold Kentucky mornings. She looked at the rust that was beginning to bloom on the fender her grandfather had washed every Sunday for 22 years. That fender was already turning orange at the edges, and the truck had only been sitting for 7 years. In another 7, the rust would be through the metal. In another 7 after that, there would be nothing left to save. She did not say another word. She turned around and walked back to the house and sat on the porch steps with her hands in her lap and watched the family move through the yard like water moving around a stone. Flowing past her, not stopping. That was 2003. The truck sat. It sat through the rest of Maren's high school years, through the mornings when she would walk past the barn on the way to the school bus and catch the outline of the Peterbilt through the gap in the door. Its chrome stack going dull. Its tires slowly losing air. Its windshield collecting a film of dust and pollen, and the dried skin of tobacco leaves that the wind blew in from the field. She never opened the barn door during those years. She told me later she was afraid, not afraid of the truck, afraid that if she looked at it too closely she would see what her father saw. a piece of junk, a waste of space, something that belonged to a dead man and had no business belonging to anyone else. The truck sat through 2 years of community college in Elizabethtown, where Maren studied general business because she did not know what else to study, and because her mother said a business degree was practical, and where she met a boy named Travis Witt, who had a nice truck and a confident smile, and absolutely nothing behind either one. She married Travis at 22 in a courthouse ceremony that cost $65 and lasted 9 minutes. The marriage lasted 14 months. It ended the way most short marriages end, not with a single catastrophe, but with the slow accumulation of small disappointments that eventually become one large silence that fills every room in the house until there is no air left to breathe. Maren moved back to the family property in Breckinridge County with a duffel bag, a dog named Rook, a black lab mix with one brown eye and one blue, who had been the only good thing to come out of those 14 months and nothing else. No furniture, no savings, no forwarding address for hope. She was 23. She had $40 in her checking account. She had no degree, no career, no plan, and a father who looked at her return the way he had looked at her request to keep the truck, with that small laugh, that quiet shake of the head, that unspoken certainty that she had once again failed to be practical. Virgil did not say anything about the divorce. He did not need to. His silence said it plainly enough. You should have picked better. You should have been smarter. You should have been someone else. Maren got a job as a parts counter clerk at the Napa Auto Parts store in Hardinsburg. She started at $11.60 an hour. She worked the counter 5 days a week and sometimes 6, looking up part numbers and cross-references for farmers and shade tree mechanics and fleet managers, and the occasional professional who came in knowing exactly what he needed and left without making eye contact. She was good at the job. She had a memory for numbers that surprised people. She could pull a Cummins fuel filter part number from her head faster than most of her co-workers could find it in the catalog system. But nobody noticed that. What they noticed was that she was young and female and stood behind a parts counter, and most of them treated her the way people treat wallpaper: present, functional, not worth a second look. She saved every dollar she did not need for rent and dog food. She did not eat out. She did not buy clothes that were not on clearance. She drove a 1998 Chevy S10 with 206,000 miles and a heater that only worked on the highest setting and a passenger side window that would not roll down. On her days off, she sat on the porch of the small house on the family property that her mother let her use for $300 a month, and she watched Rook chase squirrels across the dead grass, and she thought about things she did not say out loud to anyone because there was no one to say them to. Virgil came by for Sunday dinners. He sat at the table and ate Maren's mother's cooking and talked about the quarry and the weather and the price of limestone. He never once walked out to the barn, never once mentioned the truck, never once acknowledged that a 1974 Peterbilt 359 was sitting 120 feet from the dinner table rusting one more day toward oblivion. And that silence, that careful and deliberate silence, was its own kind of contempt. Because when a man goes out of his way to never mention something, he is telling you exactly how much it weighs on his mind. He is telling you that he has already decided, and the decision is no. 3 years passed. 3 years of counter work and saving and quiet. 3 years of Rook getting older and Maren getting lonelier and the rust on the Peterbilt getting deeper. 3 years that would have been invisible to anyone looking at her life from the outside, because from the outside nothing was happening. Everything was happening. In the spring of 2015, when Maren was 27 years old, something changed. She could not explain it to me when I asked, and I will not try to explain it to you. She said it was not a decision. She said it was more like a season breaking, like the moment in late February when winter cracks, and you cannot point to the exact hour it happened, but you know it has happened because the air smells different and the ground feels different under your boots, and something inside your chest releases a tension you did not know you were carrying. Something that had been frozen for 12 years simply thawed. On a Saturday morning in March, Maren walked into the barn with a flashlight and a can of PB Blaster penetrating oil. She had not opened that barn door in 9 years. The truck was there. Of course it was there. Where would it go? But seeing it was different from knowing it was there. The Peterbilt sat in the barn the way a sleeping animal sits in its den, heavy, still, full of something that was not quite energy but was not quite absence either, a potential, an unfinished sentence. The paint was gone in most places. The rust had spread, but it was mostly surface. She walked around the truck, slowly running her hand along the frame rail the way a doctor runs a hand along a patient's spine. Solid. She crouched down and looked at the leaf springs. Solid. The cab was solid. The bones were good. She climbed up on the step rail and opened the hood, and there it was. The Cummins NTC 350, 14 liters of cast iron and forged steel sitting in that engine bay like a heart that had stopped but not yet been buried. The intake manifold was coated in a crust of grease and dust that had hardened over 2 decades into something that felt almost organic like bark. The injector lines were stiff but uncracked. The turbocharger housing had surface rust, but no pitting, no holes, no structural betrayal. And the smell. If you have been around old iron, you know this smell. The particular sweetness of diesel fuel that has cooked into manifold gaskets over 30 years of highway miles. The metallic warmth of oil that has baked into every pore of every casting and every seal and every bolt thread. That smell does not fade. It does not wash out. It is not a good smell or a bad smell. It is the smell of time itself. It is the smell of work that was done honestly and then left unfinished. Maren put both hands flat on the valve cover and stood there without moving. She told me she could feel the cold of the metal through her palms. She told me she could feel something else, something underneath the cold, something she could not name, but that felt like a conversation she had been avoiding for 12 years. Finally beginning, whether she was ready for it or not. She started that weekend. And when I say she started, I mean she started with nothing. No engine lift, no engine hoist, no air compressor, no shop. She had a floor jack rated for 3 tons that she had bought at a yard sale in Irvington for $40. She had a set of Craftsman combination wrenches that were older than she was, with the chrome flaking off the 12mm and the 19mm slightly rounded from decades of use by a hand less careful than hers. She had a trouble light with a cracked lens, and she had a printout of the Cummins NTC 350 factory shop manual that she had found on a trucking forum online and printed at the Napa store after hours on the office printer, 237 pages single-sided, held together with a binder clip she had taken from the supply drawer. The first thing she did was change the oil. It sounds simple. It was not simple. The drain plug had been torqued on by Clayton sometime in the mid-1990s and then sealed in place by 20 years of rust and thermal cycling and the slow molecular bonding that happens when steel sits against steel long enough for the two pieces to forget they were ever separate. Maren lay on her back on the cold barn floor with a breaker bar and a 24mm socket and a can of penetrating oil, and she fought that drain plug for 2 hours. 2 hours for one bolt. Her shoulders burned. Her knuckles split open on the frame rail twice. Rook sat beside her the entire time, his chin on his paws, watching with the patient love of a creature who does not understand what is happening but knows it matters to the person he belongs to. The oil that came out was black and thick, more like roofing tar than lubricant, and it smelled like something between a refinery fire and a time capsule. She drained 11 gallons of it into a trough she had fashioned from a split-open 55-gallon drum. That was day one. She had about 1,500 more days ahead of her. Now, before I go further, I want to tell you about something that happened at the Napa store because it matters. It was the summer of 2015, about 3 months after Maren had started working on the truck. She was at the counter on a Wednesday afternoon, and she placed a special order through the Napa system for a set of Cummins NTC cylinder liner O-rings, a main bearing set, and a crankshaft rear seal. These are not the kind of parts a counter clerk orders for herself. These are the kind of parts that mean someone somewhere is about to tear a big diesel engine all the way down to the bare block and build it back from nothing. The store manager, a man named Dale Puckett, mid-50s, who had been running that Napa for 11 years and who considered himself the final word on all things mechanical, within a 30-mile radius, walked over to the counter when he saw the order on the screen. He looked at the part numbers. He looked at Maren. And he said it loud enough for 3 co-workers and 2 customers standing by the oil display to hear clearly. "Who is this order for?" "Your boyfriend." Maren looked at him. She said it was for her. There was a silence that lasted about 2 seconds. Then Puckett laughed. Not a mean laugh, not a mocking laugh. Something worse. An amused laugh. The laugh of a man who has just heard something so far outside his understanding of how the world works that he genuinely cannot process it as anything other than comedy. And behind him, 2 of the 3 co-workers laughed along. Not because they found it funny, because Dale Puckett was the boss, and laughing with the boss is what people do in small towns when they lack the courage or the job security to do anything else. The 3rd employee did not laugh. His name was Otis Henley, 68 years old, retired diesel mechanic, bad hip that made him walk with a permanent lean to the left like a fence post that had settled in soft ground. Hands so large and scarred that he used a pencil eraser to dial numbers on his phone because his fingertips could not press 1 button without pressing 3. Otis had worked on Cummins NTC engines in the 1980s when he drove for a freight outfit out of Owensboro hauling steel coil up and down the Western Kentucky Parkway in a Peterbilt not so different from the one sitting in Maren's barn. He had come to work at the Napa counter after retirement because his wife Helen had died of pancreatic cancer in 2012 and his house had become a place where the silence had weight and he needed somewhere to be that was not his kitchen table staring at the chair where Helen used to sit. Otis did not say a word to Puckett. He did not defend Maren. He did not make a speech about respect or fairness or any of the things a person might say in a movie. He just looked at Maren. And in that look was something she recognized instantly because she had seen it exactly once before, in her grandfather's eyes. The day Clayton had lifted her up to the running board of the Peterbilt when she was 9 years old and let her turn the key. That look said, "I see what you are doing, and I take it seriously." That following Saturday morning, Maren was in the barn with the shop manual open on the floor and her wrenches arranged on a piece of cardboard, trying to work out the correct sequence for pulling the fuel injectors, which the manual described in language that assumed you already knew what you were doing. She heard a truck on the gravel outside. She walked to the door and saw a maroon Ford Ranger with a dented front fender and a University of Kentucky Wildcat sticker peeling off the rear window. Otis Henley climbed out slowly, one hand on the door frame favoring the bad hip. He was carrying a thermos of coffee and an overturned 5-gallon bucket. He set the bucket down about 6 feet from the open hood of the Peterbilt. He sat on it. He unscrewed the thermos cap and poured himself a cup of coffee that was so dark it looked like motor oil and smelled like it had been brewed by someone who believed coffee was a job, not a pleasure. He looked at the engine. He looked at what Maren had done so far. And he sat there for about 10 minutes without speaking. Then he said, still looking at the engine and not at Maren, "You will want to pull the fuel supply line before you pull those injectors. If you pull the injectors first, you will crack the line fitting, and then you will be waiting 2 weeks for a replacement and hating yourself the whole time." Maren pulled the fuel supply line first. The injectors came out clean. Otis came back the following Saturday, and the one after that, and every Saturday morning for the next 3 years. He never once picked up a wrench. He never once climbed under the truck. He did not need to. What Otis Henley gave Maren Dawson was something that no parts catalog could sell and no shop manual could print. He gave her the sound of a man who had already made every mistake she was about to make. The cadence of experience, the quiet corrections that only come from having done it wrong yourself 30 years ago on a different engine, in a different barn, in a different life that was over now, but whose lessons were still sharp and still useful. When Maren was measuring the crankshaft journals with the micrometer and reading the number 3 times and still not trusting it, Otis would glance over from his bucket and say, "2.997 is fine. Do not chase a number that does not matter." And she would set the micrometer down and move to the next journal with the certainty she had not had 5 seconds earlier. When she was torquing the main bearing caps and worrying about bolt stretch, Otis would say, "I lost a bottom end once because I over-torqued the mains on a rebuild." The book says 220 foot-pounds. The book is right. Do not outthink the book. And Maren would set the wrench to 220 and click it once and move on. He never told her she was doing a good job. He never told her he believed in her. He never said anything that could be mistaken for sentiment or affection or pride. What he did was show up every Saturday, rain or cold or the thick heat of a Kentucky August. He showed up with his thermos and his bucket, and he sat there and he watched, and in the watching was everything he never said. And I want you to hold on to that image. Otis Henley sitting on a 5-gallon bucket in a tobacco barn drinking bad coffee and watching a 27-year-old woman rebuild a 40-year-old engine with hand tools and a printout. Hold on to it, because he is not going to be there much longer. And what happens when that bucket is empty is the part of this story that Maren Dawson cannot tell without going silent for a very long time. But that comes later. Right now it is 2015. Maren is 27 years old. She has a floor jack and a set of wrenches and a binder clip manual and an old man on a bucket and a dog who sleeps next to an engine block every night. And she has something else. Something nobody in that barn could see and nobody outside that barn would have believed existed. She had a plan. She had been reading, not just the shop manual, though she had read that cover to cover 4 times and could recite the torque specs for the main bearing caps in her sleep. She was reading everything. Factory service bulletins from the 1970s. Tuning guides written by long-haul owner-operators who had been running NTC Cummins engines for 200,000 miles and 300,000 miles and 500,000 miles and knew those engines the way a rancher knows his best horse. Forum posts buried 20 pages deep on websites where men with decades of diesel grease under their fingernails argued late into the night about injector timing and boost curves and the thermodynamic properties of a 14-liter cast iron block with a 13-to-1 compression ratio. And what Maren had figured out sitting at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with her laptop open and Rook asleep on her feet was something that most people in the pulling world had either forgotten or had never understood in the first place. The Cummins NTC 3.5. O was not fast, it was not loud, it was not spectacular. What it was by any honest engineering measure was one of the most absurdly overbuilt power plants ever bolted into a truck. Cast iron block thick enough to stop a bullet. Forged steel crankshaft with 7 main bearings fully counterweighted. Forged steel connecting rods I-beam cross-section, each one weighing 9 pounds. Wet sleeve cylinder liners that you could pull and replace without removing the engine from the chassis. The whole assembly had been designed by Cummins engineers in the 1960s to do one thing and do it for 500,000 miles. Pull heavy loads at sustained speed without complaint. And here was the piece that mattered. The piece that nobody in those grandstands at Shelby County would understand until it was far too late to do anything about it. The NTC 350 made its peak torque at 1300 RPM. 1300. That is barely above idle. Most modern engines need to spin to 5 or 6 or 7,000 revolutions per minute before they find their power. The Cummins found it while it was practically loafing. It made its best force, its deepest pull, its most relentless push when it was turning slowly, grinding, leaning into a load the way a draft horse leans into a harness. Not with speed, with weight, with patience, with the accumulated authority of 14 liters of iron and steel turning at a pace that suggested it had all the time in the world. Maren did not know yet exactly how she would use that, but she knew it mattered. She knew it the way a person knows there is water under the ground before the well is drilled, not because someone told her, because she had put her hands on the engine and read the numbers and listened to the old men on the forums who had spent their lives behind the wheel of trucks just like this one. And something in her mind had aligned, clicked into place, like a crankshaft finding top dead center. She did not tell anyone, not Otis, not her mother, certainly not Virgil. She kept the plan the way you keep a seed through winter, close to the chest, quiet, waiting for the right soil and the right season and the right amount of light. And the Peterbilt sat in the barn, and Maren worked on it every evening after her shift at Napa, and Otis came on Saturdays with his thermos, and Rook slept against the oil pan every winter night as if the cold iron were a wood stove. The months became a year, the year became two, and outside the barn the world moved on without the slightest idea that in a tobacco shed in Breckinridge County, Kentucky, a woman making $11.60 an hour with a shop manual held together by a binder clip was quietly building something that 4,000 people would one day lose their minds over. But I am getting ahead of myself, because before the triumph there was the work. And before the work paid off, there was a long season where it almost did not, where the engine broke her heart before it ever turned a wheel, where the one person who believed in what she was doing disappeared from the earth without warning, and where Maren Cade Dawson had to decide completely alone in a freezing barn with grease on her knuckles and grief sitting in her chest like a stone whether the thing she had been building for years was still worth finishing. That part is next. And let me tell you something, it is the part of this story that separates the people who understand what Maren did from the people who think this is just about a truck pull. It was never just about a truck pull, it was never even about a truck, it was about what happens when the only person who sees you clearly is gone, and you have to decide whether you are going to keep building in the dark. In the summer of 2016, Maren pulled the engine. That sentence is 6 words long. The job took 11 days. I want you to understand what pulling the engine means because it is easy to say and it is not easy to do, and the difference between those two things is where this story lives. The Cummins NTC 350 weighs 2,800 pounds. That is the weight of a small car. It sits in the engine bay of a Peterbilt 359 bolted to the frame rails and connected to the truck by approximately 147 individual fasteners, hoses, wiring harnesses, coolant lines, fuel lines, exhaust, manifolds, motor mounts, and a bell housing that mates the engine to a 13-speed transmission that weighs another 360 pounds. To remove that engine, you have to disconnect every single one of those connections, label them, bag the hardware, and then lift 2,800 pounds of cast iron vertically out of the engine bay without dropping it, without cracking the block on the frame, without snapping a lifting bracket, and without killing yourself. Maren did not have an engine hoist. She did not have a shop crane. She did not have a forklift or an overhead beam rated for 3,000 pounds or any of the equipment that a professional shop would consider the absolute minimum for this job. What she had was a rented cherry picker from a tool rental place in Elizabethtown that cost her $45 a day and a come-along winch that she had bolted to a crossbeam in the barn roof. The crossbeam was original to the barn. It had been there since 1938 when Maren's great-grandfather built the structure from locally milled oak to cure tobacco. It was solid wood 12 inches by 12 inches, and it had held the weight of thousands of pounds of hanging tobacco leaf for decades. But it had never held an engine, and Maren was not entirely sure it would. She spent the first 3 days disconnecting. She worked from the shop manual, following the procedure step by step, labeling every bolt and every hose, fitting with strips of masking tape on which she wrote the location and the torque spec in permanent marker. She filled freezer bags with hardware and laid them out in rows on a folding table that she had set up against the wall. By the end of the 3rd day, the table looked like a museum exhibit. 47 bags arranged in the exact order they would need to go back, each one labeled in Maren's handwriting, which was small and precise in a way that would have reminded you of Clayton's logbook if you had ever seen it. Otis was there for the disconnection. He sat on his bucket and watched and said almost nothing for 3 days, which for Otis was a sign that things were going well. When Otis was quiet, it meant you were doing it right. When he spoke, it meant you were about to do it wrong. On day 4, Maren attached the lifting chains to the engine. She ran them through the factory lifting eyes on the block, 2 forged steel loops that Cummins had cast into the iron for exactly this purpose. She attached the chains to the come-along, and she looked up at the crossbeam, and she asked herself a question that she did not ask out loud, because Otis was sitting 6 feet away, and she did not want him to hear the doubt in her voice. She cranked the come-along. The chains went taut, the beam creaked, the sound was deep and organic like a tree bending in wind. Maren stopped cranking. She looked at the beam, she looked at the chains, she looked at the engine which had lifted about a 1/4 inch off the motor mounts, and was now suspended entirely by a piece of 80-year-old oak, and a come-along winch, and her willingness to believe that all of it would hold. She cranked again. The engine rose. 1 inch, 2 inches. The beam creaked again, louder this time. Sawdust fell from the joint where the beam met the wall plate. Rook, who had been sleeping next to the front tire, stood up and moved to the far corner of the barn, which Maren took as either a sign that dogs can sense structural failure or a sign that Rook did not like sawdust in his fur. The engine cleared the frame rails. It hung there, 2,800 pounds of Cummins iron swinging gently on chains in a tobacco barn, and the beam held. Maren lowered it onto a pallet she had built from oak planks, salvaged from a collapsed fence on the back of the property, and when the weight settled and the chains went slack, she sat down on the barn floor and put her face in her hands and stayed there for about 5 minutes, not crying, just breathing, just letting the adrenaline work its way out of her bloodstream. Otis poured her a cup of coffee from his thermos. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The engine was on the pallet. The beam had held. The coffee was terrible. Maren spent the next 7 months taking that engine apart on the barn floor. She worked in the evenings after her shift at Napa, usually from about 5:30 until 9 or 10. By the light of 2 shop lights, she had hung from nails in the wall studs. She worked on Saturdays when Otis was there, and on Sundays when he was not. She cataloged every component, every push rod, every valve spring, every injector cup, every head bolt. She measured the crankshaft journals with the micrometer, checking each one against the factory spec in the manual, writing the numbers in a spiral notebook that she kept on the folding table next to the freezer bags. Rook slept next to the engine block every night that fall and winter. The barn had no heat except a small electric space heater that Maren ran on an extension cord from the house, and on cold nights the only warm thing in the building was the dog and the space heater and Maren's own body heat. The engine block held the cold the way stone holds cold deep and total, and on mornings when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees, Maren would come out to the barn at 5:30 before work and find frost on the cylinder head, and Rook curled against the oil pan like it was a wood stove. She told me those were the loneliest months. November, December, January. The space heater clicking on and off in the dark. The parts laid out on the table like a puzzle she was not certain she could solve. The manual open to a page she had read 30 times and still did not fully trust. The sound of her own breathing and the sound of the dog breathing and nothing else. No radio, no music. Just the work and the cold and the slow, careful process of understanding something one piece at a time. But she also told me it was the only time in her life when she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Have you ever had that? Have you ever been in a place that was cold and uncomfortable and uncertain, where the outcome was not guaranteed and nobody was watching and nobody was going to congratulate you if you got it right, and felt in your bones that this was the thing you were put on the earth to do? If you have, then you understand, Maren. If you have not, I hope you find it, because a person can go a whole life without it, and that is its own kind of loss. By the spring of 2017, the engine was stripped to the bare block. Maren had bored the cylinders herself, renting a portable boring bar from the same tool rental in Elizabethtown. She had decked the head at a machine shop in Louisville, driving the cylinder head up there in the bed of her S10, wrapped in moving blankets. She had installed new wet sleeve liners, new pistons, new rings, new rod bearings, new main bearings. She had set the valve lash at 14 thousandths on the intake and 27 thousandths on the exhaust cold by hand with a feeler gauge that had belonged to Clayton. His initials were scratched into the handle. CD. The same initials that were scratched into the toolbox that she did not yet know was coming. And then she found the turbo. The Holset HX80 turbocharger is not a part you find at a Napa store. It is not a part you find at most diesel shops. It is an industrial unit originally designed for mining equipment and marine generators machines that operate at sustained load for hours and days at a time without rest. It is massive. The compressor wheel alone is 4 inches in diameter. The turbine housing is cast iron thick enough to stop a wrench thrown in frustration, which more than one mechanic has tested over the years. Maren found one on a heavy equipment salvage website pulled from a Caterpillar generator set that had been decommissioned from a coal mine in West Virginia. The price was $1,100. Shipping was another $240. Maren had $1,412 in her savings account. She also needed a new roof on the east side of the barn, where water had been leaking through during every rain for the past 2 years, dripping onto the folding table and warping the cardboard boxes where she stored the cleaned and oiled parts. A new roof, even a patch job with corrugated steel, would cost about $800 in materials. She could afford the turbo or the roof, not both. Maren bought the turbo. She covered the leaking section of the barn roof with a blue polyethylene tarp held down by cinder blocks, and she told herself she would fix the roof next year. She did not fix the roof next year. The tarp is still there. The turbo arrived in the wooden crate on the back of a freight truck in June of 2017. Maren opened the crate in the barn with a pry bar and lifted the HX80 out with both hands. It weighed about 45 pounds. The compressor housing had been sandblasted and was clean. The turbine housing still had carbon deposits from its years in the mine. The shaft spun freely when she turned the compressor wheel with her finger, a good sign, meaning the bearings were still within spec. She spent the rest of 2017 fabricating. The HX80 was not designed to bolt onto a Cummins NTC. There was no kit, no bracket, no adapter plate you could order from a catalog. Every connection between the turbo and the engine had to be made from scratch. Maren built the exhaust manifold adapter from mild steel plate that she cut and welded at a friend's shop in Hardinsburg. The friend, a woman named Beth Cawley, who ran a small welding and fabrication business out of a pole barn behind her house, let Maren use the MIG welder on evenings and weekends in exchange for Maren helping with inventory and cleanup. Maren had never welded before that summer. She learned the way she learned everything, slowly, painfully, with burnt fingers and bad beads, and the particular frustration of watching something that looks simple when someone else does it become impossibly difficult when you try it yourself. Her first welds looked like someone had dripped candle wax on steel. Her 20th were passable. By her 50th, Beth Cawley told her she could get a job welding pipe if the Napa thing did not work out. Maren did not smile, but something in her eyes changed when Beth said that. She fabricated the intake manifold, the downpipe, the oil feed line for the turbo bearings, and the oil return line, all from materials she sourced from salvage yards and online surplus dealers. Total cost of fabrication materials for the entire turbo installation was $322. The turbo itself cost $1,100. The knowledge to make it all work cost 4 years. By the late fall of 2017, the engine was back together. Block rebuilt, head torqued, turbo mounted, fuel system plumbed, wiring reconnected. It sat in the Peterbilt on the pallet, waiting to be lifted back into the engine bay, and it looked like a different creature than the one Maren had pulled out of that truck 16 months earlier. The castings were clean. The new gaskets were bright orange and blue against the gray iron. The HX80 sat on the exhaust manifold like a mechanical heart waiting to beat. And then came the moment. I want you to understand what this moment meant, because if you have ever built something with your hands over a long period of time, if you have ever torn something down to its bones and put it back together and then arrived at the instant where you find out whether all of it worked or all of it was for nothing, then you know the feeling I am about to describe. It is not excitement. It is not anticipation. It is terror. Pure and absolute terror, because you have spent years and every dollar you have and every evening and every weekend and every ounce of faith you possess on a single bet, and the universe is about to tell you whether you were right or wrong, and there is no way to prepare for the answer. Maren reinstalled the engine in December of 2017 using the same come-along and the same crossbeam that had held the first time, and that she now trusted the way you trust something that has already saved your life once. She reconnected every hose, every wire, every fuel line, every coolant line. She filled the cooling system. She primed the fuel system by hand, cranking the lift pump until diesel wept from the injector fittings. She checked the oil level 3 times. She stood on the step rail and looked down at the engine and went through the shop manual checklist one line at a time, touching each connection with her finger as she verified it. Otis was there. He was sitting on his bucket. He had not said a word in 40 minutes. Maren climbed into the cab. She sat in the driver's seat that Clayton had sat in for 22 years, and she could feel the impression his body had left in the foam through the cracked vinyl cover. She put her hand on the key. She turned it. The starter motor engaged. The engine turned over. Once, twice, 3 times, and on the 4th revolution the Cummins NTC caught. It fired. The sound came up from the block through the frame rails and through the cab floor and through the seat and into Maren's spine, a deep rolling percussion that shook the dust off every surface in the barn. The exhaust stack coughed a cloud of black smoke that hit the barn ceiling and spread. The turbo began to whistle faintly, a thin note rising under the engine noise like a voice trying to be heard. And then 3 seconds after it started, the engine died. Not a slow death, not a gradual fade, a sudden stop. A metallic bang from somewhere on the right side of the block, followed by a hiss, followed by silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence that fills a room after something has gone badly wrong and everyone in the room knows it. Maren sat in the cab. She did not move. She did not turn the key again. She could smell raw diesel, which meant fuel was leaking somewhere it should not be leaking. She could smell hot metal, which meant something had gotten too hot too fast. She climbed out of the cab slowly. She walked around to the right side of the engine. The number 4 injector line had cracked. Not at the fitting where Otis had warned her it might crack 2 years earlier. At the body of the line itself, about 3 inches from the injector, where a stress fracture that had been invisible to the eye and undetectable by touch had waited patiently through the rebuild and the reinstallation and the priming and the first 3 seconds of combustion before it finally let go. Diesel was pooling on the exhaust manifold, which was already hot enough to smoke. If the engine had run 10 seconds longer, the fuel on the manifold could have caught fire. In a barn, with no extinguisher within reach. Maren turned off the fuel supply valve. She wiped the diesel off the manifold with a rag. She stood there looking at the cracked line for a long time. Otis had gotten off his bucket and was standing next to her looking at the same thing. Neither of them spoke. The barn was quiet except for the ticking of hot metal cooling and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the road. That night, Maren sat at her kitchen table with her phone in her hand. It was close to 11 o'clock. Rook was asleep under the table. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when you are alone, and the day has gone wrong and the walls seem to lean in closer than they should. She called Virgil. She did not plan to call him. She did not decide to call him. Her thumb found the number the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. Automatically. Without permission. And when he picked up, she heard the television in the background, the late news, and she heard her father's voice, thick with the half-sleep of a man who had been dozing in his chair and was not happy to be awake. She told him the engine had fired and then died. She told him about the cracked injector line. She told him she would need to order a new line and wait for it and install it and try again. She told him all of this in the flat voice of someone who is reporting facts, because reporting facts is easier than saying what you actually feel. There was a silence. 10 seconds. The television murmured in the background. And then Virgil said what Virgil had been waiting 3 years to say. I told you, Maren. 3 words. That was all. 3 words and then nothing. No follow-up, no explanation, no anger and no sympathy and no advice. Just the verdict he had rendered 16 years earlier in a funeral yard, delivered again efficiently the way a man delivers a truth he considers self-evident. Maren sat with the phone against her ear for another few seconds. She could hear her father breathing. She could hear the television. She could hear the particular quality of silence that exists between 2 people who love each other and cannot find a way to make that love useful. She said good night. He said good night. She set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at it, and then looked at the wall, and then looked at Rook, who had opened one eye and was watching her with the bottomless patience of a dog who has seen his person sit at this table in this posture many times before. She did not cry. She had used up her crying years ago during the divorce, during the move back to Breckinridge County, during the first winter in the barn when the space heater broke and she worked in a coat so heavy she could barely move her arms. She was past crying. What she felt was something flatter than sadness, something more structural. Like a load-bearing wall developing a crack so fine you cannot see it, but you can feel it when you put your hand against the plaster. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she drove to Napa and worked her shift and ordered a replacement number 4 injector line and was told it would take 9 days. It took 14. During those 14 days, Maren did not go into the barn. Not once. She went to work. She came home. She fed Rook. She sat on the porch. And she thought about Virgil's 3 words the way you think about a rock in your shoe. Constantly. Without being able to stop. On the 15th day, the injector line arrived. On the 16th day, Maren installed it. On the 17th day, she turned the key again. The engine fired and held. The Cummins ran for 10 minutes in the barn, filling the space with noise and heat and smoke and the high, thin whistle of the HX80 turbo beginning to spool. Maren sat in the cab and listened to the engine run and felt the vibration through the seat and through the steering wheel and through her hands, and she allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite joy and not quite relief but was adjacent to both. Something in the neighborhood of survival. She shut the engine down and climbed out and walked to the barn door and stood there in the evening air and breathed. Otis was not there. It was a Tuesday. Otis only came on Saturdays. But his bucket was still in the corner where he always left it, and his thermos cap, the one he used as a coffee cup, was sitting on top of the bucket, and seeing those 2 things made Maren feel less alone than she had felt in 2 weeks. Through the spring and summer of 2018, Maren dialed in the engine. She installed larger injector tips 370 rated up from the factory, 350 tips. She adjusted the fuel rack on the injection pump to increase fuel delivery. She plumbed an intercooler into the intake tract between the turbo and the manifold, using a unit she pulled from a junked Freightliner at a salvage yard in Radcliffe for $60. Each modification was small. Each one was calculated. Each one was a step toward a number that Maren had been carrying in her head for 2 years, a number she had worked out on paper at her kitchen table using thermodynamic formulas she had taught herself from a college textbook she found at a library sale for $3. She did not share the number with anyone. Not with Otis, not with Beth Cawley, certainly not with Virgil. The number was hers. She kept it the way a gambler keeps an ace. And then October came, and October took Otis Henley away. It was a Thursday. Maren was at the Napa counter when the news came through. Dale Puckett, the same manager who had laughed at her 3 years earlier, walked over and told her that Otis had died that morning. Heart attack. Quick. In his kitchen. He had been pouring coffee from the same thermos he brought to the barn every Saturday, and his heart had simply stopped. He was 68 years old. Maren finished her shift. She drove to the funeral home and sat in her truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going inside. She signed the guest book. She looked at Otis in the casket and thought that he looked smaller than he had looked on the bucket, which is something that death does to men who were large in life. It makes them look like they have been returned to a size they were never meant to be. The funeral was 3 days later. Maren sat in the back row. She did not speak to anyone. She did not go to the reception afterward. She drove home. She went into the barn. The engine was in the truck, fully assembled, fully plumbed, the HX80 turbo, sitting on the manifold with its compressor inlet pointed toward the barn door, like it was waiting for air to breathe. Maren put her hand on the engine block. The metal was cold. It was always cold in October. She stood there with her palm flat against the casting, and she thought about Otis sitting on his bucket. She thought about the coffee that tasted like motor oil. She thought about his voice saying 2.997 is fine, do not chase a number that does not matter. She thought about every Saturday morning for 3 years when that maroon Ford Ranger had pulled up outside, and she had known before the door even opened that she was not alone in this. And now she was alone in this. The bucket was in the corner. The thermos cap was on top of the bucket. Nobody would ever sit on that bucket again. Nobody would ever pour coffee from that thermos again. The barn was the same size it had always been, but it felt larger now in the way that rooms feel larger when someone who filled them is gone. Maren thought about quitting that night. I am telling you this because she told me and because I think you need to hear it. She thought about selling the truck. She thought about calling a scrap dealer in Brandenburg, the same one her brother had mentioned 16 years ago, and telling him to come get it. She thought about Virgil's voice on the phone saying, "I told you, Maren." She thought about the fact that the one person who had believed in what she was doing, the one person who showed up every Saturday with his thermos and his bucket and his quiet faith that a 27-year-old woman with a binder clip manual could rebuild a 40-year-old engine, was lying in a funeral home in Hardinsburg and would never sit in this barn again. She stood with her hand on the engine for a long time. She could feel the cold of the iron through her palm. She could feel the crosshatch pattern of the machining marks on the block. She could feel the slight oil film on the surface, the residue of an engine that was alive and waiting. The engine did not care about grief. The engine did not know that Otis was gone. The engine was just metal and math and the promise of combustion. It did not care who sat in the barn or who did not. It only cared whether someone was going to finish what they started. Maren took her hand off the block. She turned off the barn light. She walked back to the house. She did not call the scrap dealer. She did not call Virgil. She went to bed and lay there in the dark and listened to Rook breathing at the foot of the bed and made a decision that she did not announce to anyone because there was no one left to announce it to. She would finish. She spent the winter of 2018 and the early months of 2019 alone in the barn. No Otis, no bucket, no thermos, just Maren and the engine and the manual and the numbers in her head. She tuned the fuel delivery. She adjusted the boost wastegate. She set the turbo boost controller to hold 42 pounds of pressure, a number she had calculated as the maximum the stock bottom end could safely handle given the new pistons and the ring gap she had set and the head gasket thickness she had chosen. In March of 2019, Maren loaded the Peterbilt onto a rented flatbed and drove it to a chassis dynamometer shop outside Lexington. The shop owner, a man named Earl Whitfield, who had been dyno testing diesel trucks since the 1990s, looked at the Peterbilt when Maren backed it off the trailer. He looked at the rust. He looked at the tarp-covered hood. He looked at the exhaust stack that had no chrome and no rain cap, and he looked at Maren. He did not laugh. He did not ask if she was sure. He had been in the business long enough to know that the trucks that looked like nothing were sometimes the ones that broke the machine. Maren strapped the Peterbilt to the dyno. She started the engine. She brought the RPM up slowly, watching the boost gauge, listening to the turbo, feeling the vibration through the frame. The HX80 began to whistle. The boost gauge climbed. 20 pounds, 25, 30, 35. The dyno operator watched the numbers on his screen and his face changed. 40 pounds, 42. The wastegate cracked and held. The numbers came up on the screen. 812 horsepower, 2100 foot-pounds of torque at 1400 revolutions per minute. Let me put that in context for you. Let me give you the math, because the math is the weapon, and without the math, the rest of this story is just a woman beating a man at a truck pull. Colby Griggs and his Aerotech pulling truck made 2200 horsepower, almost 3 times what Maren's Peterbilt was making. On paper, on a spec sheet, Colby wins and it is not close. But pulling is not a horsepower contest. Pulling is a torque contest. The sled that you hook to on a pulling track has a weight transfer box that slides forward as you pull. The farther you pull, the heavier the sled gets. At 50 feet, you are pulling roughly the same load you started with. At 100 feet, you are pulling twice that. At 200 feet, you are pulling 3 to 4 times the starting weight. The sled is designed to eventually stop you. That is the whole point. The question is not whether you get stopped. The question is how far you get before it happens. And what moves a sled that is getting heavier by the foot is not peak horsepower at 7,000 revolutions per minute. It is torque, low sustained grinding torque, the kind of torque that an engine makes when it is turning slowly and pushing hard, the way a draft horse leans into a loaded harness, not with speed, with force. Colby Griggs had 1,200 foot-pounds of torque. He had to get his engine to 5,000 revolutions per minute to find it. Maren had 2,100 foot-pounds of torque. She found it at 1,400 RPM, barely above idle. The old Peterbilt was making nearly twice the twisting force at a lazy rumble that the Aerotech machine made at full scream. And that twisting force would be there from the moment the clutch dropped to the moment the sled stopped or the track ran out. Constant, relentless, like gravity. Maren looked at the dyno numbers on the screen, and she did not pump her fist, and she did not yell, and she did not call anyone. She asked Earl Whitfield to print the dyno sheet. He printed it. She folded it, once put it in the glove box of the Peterbilt right next to Clayton's logbook that she had found there during the rebuild and had never removed, and she drove home. She registered for the Shelby County Big Rig Pull that afternoon. The registration was online. The fee was $200. She paid it with her debit card, and the confirmation email arrived in her inbox at 4:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in March, and nobody in the world knew about it except Maren and the Shelby County Fair Association and the dog sleeping on the couch. She did not paint the truck. Let me say that again because it matters. She did not paint the truck. The Peterbilt was still wearing the same rust it had been wearing since Maren opened that barn door in 2015. The same patina, the same bare metal, the same absence of chrome and polish and anything that might suggest to a casual observer that this truck was anything other than a relic dragged out of a field by someone who did not know any better. 3 people later asked Maren why she did not paint it. 3 people got the same answer. She said if I painted it, they would take it seriously. I do not want them to take it seriously. I want them to see what they expect to see. She wanted them looking at the rust while the turbo spooled. Now I need to take you forward, 4 months forward, to a Saturday in July, to a fairground in Shelby County, to 4,000 people in grandstands looking down at a dirt track where a woman in cowboy boots was standing next to a truck that every one of them had already written off. What would you have done in her place? After everything. After the years in the barn and the cracked injector line and the phone call with Virgil and the funeral and the empty bucket in the corner. After earning $11.60 an hour for 4 years and spending every spare dollar on gaskets and bearings and a turbo from a coal mine. After all of that, would you have driven that truck onto a fairground and parked it next to a $185,000 machine and told the man at the registration table that yes, you were sure? Would you have had the nerve to leave the rust on, to let them laugh? To know what was under the hood and let the world believe it was nothing? Drop that in the comments. Because I want to know. And I want to know because the next part of this story, the part where Maren Cade Dawson drives that Peterbilt to the starting line, and 4,000 people learn that every assumption they made was wrong, That part only means something if you understand what it cost her to get there. It cost her 4 years. It cost her 1,400 days. It cost her the only mentor she ever had. It cost her whatever remained of her relationship with her father. It cost her every evening and every weekend and every dollar that did not go to rent and dog food for 4 years of her life. And she showed up with rust on the hood and 42 pounds of boost in the manifold and 2,100 foot-pounds of torque that nobody could see and nobody expected and nobody was ready for. The pull was scheduled for 4:30 in the afternoon. The grandstands had been full since 3. The word had gotten around that some woman had registered a rusted-out Peterbilt in Superstock, and the crowd had come for the same reason crowds always come when something looks like a mismatch. They came to watch something go wrong, to see the punchline, to record the embarrassment on their phones and show it to their friends and say, "You will not believe what I saw at Shelby County. Some woman brought a Peterbilt from the 1970s. Looked like it came out of a junkyard." We all laughed. They had no idea what they were about to see. They had no idea that the laughter was about to stop, not because anyone decided to stop laughing, but because something was about to fill the air that left no room for laughter, no room for assumptions, no room for anything except the sound of a 45-year-old engine remembering what it was built to do. And Maren Cade Dawson sitting in the cab of her grandfather's truck with the rust on the hood and the boost gauge reading 0 and the dyno sheet folded in the glove box was about to show them. Colby Griggs pulled first. His crew fired up the Aerotech engine and the sound hit the grandstands like a physical force. That high keening shriek of a methanol engine at full boost. The turbocharger screaming, the exhaust popping bright orange flames on the overrun. It was violent. It was designed to be violent. The noise alone was a statement, a declaration that serious money and serious engineering had built this machine for one purpose, and that purpose was about to be fulfilled. Colby hooked to the sled. The chain went taut. The rear tires dug into the clay, and for one frozen second the truck sat there, shaking, loading, vibrating with the tension between 2,200 horsepower and a sled that did not want to move. Then the tires bit. The truck launched forward. The sled broke free and started sliding down the track with a grinding sound that you could feel in your teeth. The crowd roared. Colby drove that sled 267 feet before the weight transfer box slid far enough forward to bury the pan into the clay and bring everything to a stop. 267 feet. That was a strong pull. The grandstands knew it. Colby climbed out of the cab and pumped his fist, and the crowd gave him exactly what he came for. Applause and noise and the satisfaction of having watched something loud do something impressive. Then Maren's Peterbilt rolled to the line. The crowd did not go silent. That would suggest respect, and there was no respect in that moment. What happened was something different. The noise changed. The applause for Colby faded and was replaced by a murmur that had laughter woven through it. There were shouts. There were jokes yelled from the upper rows. There were a few things called out that Maren heard and pretended she did not, things about the truck and things about her, and I will not repeat them because they do not deserve the air. But underneath the laughing and the shouting there was a quietness. The kind of quietness that moves through a crowd when something unexpected has appeared and nobody quite knows what to make of it. The way a room changes when someone walks in who does not belong. Maren did not look at the grandstands. She did not wave. She did not acknowledge the crowd in any way. She climbed up into the cab of the Peterbilt the way a person climbs into a truck they have climbed into 1,000 times. No ceremony, no hesitation, Just the grab handle and the step rail and the door closing behind her with a solid click that was lost in the noise. Here is what happened next, and I am going to tell it to you the way 3 different people who were there told it to me, because all 3 of them remembered the same thing. Maren turned the key. The engine did not start right away. There was a pause. The starter motor engaged and the engine turned over with a grinding sound that carried across the track, and the crowd's laughter began to build. 2 seconds, 3 seconds. This was the moment they had been waiting for. This was the punchline they had come to see. The old truck would not start. The woman did not know what she was doing. The joke was writing itself. And then the Cummins caught. Not with a roar, not with a scream, not with anything resembling the sound that Colby's methanol engine had made. The Cummins NTC 35 came to life with a sound that rose from somewhere deep and low and ancient, like a door opening in a stone basement that had been sealed for decades. A rolling, heavy, percussive thud that you did not just hear with your ears. You felt it. You felt it in your ribs and in your sternum and in the small bones of your inner ear. It came through the dirt of the track. It came through the steel of the bleacher supports. It came through the wooden seats and through the soles of 4,000 pairs of boots and shoes and sneakers. It came up from the ground itself like something that had been sleeping underneath the earth and had just now, in this moment, in this place, decided to wake up. The Peterbilt's exhaust stack, a single vertical pipe, no chrome, no rain cap, just raw steel, gone brown with heat and weather, began pushing black smoke in slow, heavy pulses. Each pulse was a cylinder firing. Each pulse was a piston driving 2,100 foot-pounds of force through a crankshaft that had been turning since the Nixon administration. And then the turbo began to spool. If you have ever heard a Holset HX80 turbocharger come alive on a big-bore Cummins, you do not need me to describe this sound. If you have not, I will try. It starts as a whisper. A thin high note, almost like a tea kettle warming on a stove somewhere behind the engine noise. You are not sure you are hearing it at first. You think it might be the wind, or a noise from the grandstand or your own imagination. And then it builds. It climbs in pitch and volume, layering itself over the exhaust percussion, and it is not a whisper anymore. It is a whistle. And then it is not a whistle, it is a whine, and then it is not a whine, it is a scream, but not the sharp, brittle scream of a methanol engine. This was deeper, fuller. It was the sound of air being compressed to 42 pounds per square inch and forced into 14 liters of cast iron at 1,400 revolutions per minute. It was the sound of something mechanical remembering what it had been built to do 45 years ago and deciding in this moment on this dirt track in front of 4,000 people who had come to laugh to do it one more time. The laughter stopped. I want you to understand that. The laughter did not fade. It did not trail off. It stopped. The way a candle stops when you blow it out. Not because anyone in that crowd decided to stop laughing. Not because anyone held up a hand or shook a head or made a conscious choice. The laughter stopped because a bigger sound replaced it. The turbo whistle filled the fairgrounds the way water fills a glass. From the bottom up, rising through the dirt and through the bleacher steel and through the air until there was no space left in any of it for laughter. No space left for jokes. No space for anything except the sound of that engine and the realization spreading through 4,000 people at once like cold water poured down the back of a shirt that something was very different about this truck. Maren hooked to the sled. The chain went tight. The slack came out with a single sharp crack that echoed off the grandstand roof like a rifle shot. And then there was a moment of stillness. The truck and the sled and the chain and the crowd, all of it balanced on the edge of something like the pause between a lightning flash and the thunder that follows. Maren brought the RPM up, not high, not to the scream range where Colby's engine had found its power. She brought the needle to 1400 RPM, the exact point she knew by feel and by sound, and by the vibration that traveled through the steering wheel into her hands and up her arms and into her chest. 1400 revolutions per minute, the sweet spot. The place where 42 pounds of boost and 14 liters of displacement and 13-to-1 compression and larger injector tips and every night she had spent in that barn for 4 years conspired to produce 2,100 foot-pounds of twisting force. The place where all that cast iron and forged steel and all that patience and all that solitude became something that could move the earth. She dropped the clutch. The Peterbilt did not launch. It did not spin the tires. It did not bark or scream or throw dirt into the sky the way Colby's truck had. What it did was settle. The front end dipped about 2 inches as the weight transferred rearward, and the drive tires pressed into the clay with 11,000 pounds of truck pushing down on them. The rubber deformed against the clay. The clay compressed under the rubber. And there was a moment, a half second, where the truck and the sled and the chain existed in perfect tension, balance between moving and not moving, between physics and will. And then the truck leaned forward. Not fast, not violent, steady. It leaned into the sled the way a draft horse leans into a loaded harness. All weight, all will, all patience. And the sled moved. The chain went rigid. The sled pan bit into the clay and started cutting a groove. The dirt curled up on both sides like a plow furrow in a spring field. The resistance was already building. At 50 feet, the weight transfer box on the sled had shifted forward about 18 inches, adding roughly 4,000 pounds of effective downforce to the pan. At 100 feet, it had shifted 3 feet. The sled was fighting back with everything it had, clawing at the dirt, pressing down, getting heavier with every inch of forward motion. This is where most trucks start to struggle. This is where the RPM drops and the engine bogs and the tires spin and the pull dies. This is where 2,200 horsepower runs out of answers because horsepower is just a number and the sled does not care about numbers. The sled cares about torque. The Cummins NTC did not bog. The RPM needle sat at 1400 like it had been welded there. The exhaust note did not change. The turbo whistle climbed a half tone, then a full tone, the wastegate cracking open for a microsecond and then sealing shut again as the boost controller held 42 pounds steady, and the engine just kept pushing, converting diesel fuel into rotational force at a rate of 2,100 foot-pounds per revolution, 1,400 revolutions per minute. Each revolution sent that force through the clutch, through the transmission, down the drive shaft, through the rear axle, into the tires, into the clay, and into a sled that was getting heavier by the foot. The crowd was on its feet, all 4,000 of them. Not because someone started a wave or because the announcer told them to stand. They were standing because something in their bodies had taken over. Something older than thought. The recognition that they were witnessing a thing that was not supposed to be happening, and that was happening anyway, and that the correct response to such a thing is to be on your feet. Maren passed 100 feet, and the sled was still moving. She passed 150, and a sound started in the grandstands. Not cheering, not yet. Something before cheering. Something involuntary. A collective intake of breath that turned into a low, rising moan, the sound a crowd makes when it begins to understand that what it is seeing is not what it expected to see. At 175 feet, a man in the third row grabbed the arm of the stranger sitting next to him. Neither of them noticed. At 200 feet, 3 people were filming with their phones held sideways, and every one of them had their mouths open. At 220, someone in the top row of the grandstands yelled one word, a name, Maren, and it was like a match dropped into dry grass. The whole grandstand caught fire. The sound was enormous. It rolled down from the bleachers and hit the track and bounced back, and the Peterbilt moved through it like a ship through a wave, steady, relentless. The exhaust thumping and the turbo screaming and the tires grinding clay into powder. 230, 240, 250. The sled was buried now, the pan cutting a groove 6 inches deep, throwing clay to both sides like a boat throwing wake. The chain was vibrating with tension, a single steel line humming with 30,000 pounds of pull force, visible from the grandstands. If you knew where to look, singing a note that no one could hear over the noise, but that everyone could feel through the metal of the bleachers and the soles of their shoes. 260. People in the crowd were holding on to each other, strangers grabbing the arms of strangers. A woman in the 5th row had tears running down her face, and she could not have told you why. A man near the top of the grandstands who had farmed cotton in West Tennessee for 40 years, and who had driven a truck not so different from that Peterbilt when he was younger, had both fists clenched at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes locked on the exhaust stack like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. 267. That was the number Colby Griggs had put up in his $185,000 purpose-built pulling machine. 267 feet. The Peterbilt did not stop. It did not slow down. It did not hesitate. 270, 275, 280. The noise from the grandstands had become continuous, a wall of sound that competed with the Cummins and lost because 4,000 human voices cannot match the output of an engine that was designed to pull 70,000 pounds up a 6% grade on Interstate 65 without breaking a sweat. 285, 290. The end of the track was at 300 feet, and nobody in Superstock had reached it all season. 292, 295. The tires were biting clay and the frame was flexing. You could see the cab twist a 1/4 inch on the frame rails if you knew where to look. The sled was screaming against the dirt, a high grinding shriek of steel on clay that mixed with the turbo whistle and the exhaust percussion and the roar of the crowd into a sound that was not like any sound any of those 4,000 people had ever heard before. 298, 299, 300, full pull, the flag dropped, the air horn sounded, and 4,000 people lost their minds. Now there is something I have not told you yet, something that makes this more than a story about a truck pull, something that makes this a story about a father and a daughter and the distance between what we say and what we mean and the years that sometimes have to pass before a man can close that distance. Standing at the fence line about 40 feet from where the Peterbilt crossed the 300-foot mark was a man named Virgil Dawson, Maren's father, the man who had told her to sell the truck, the man who had said she did not know what she was looking at, the man who had laughed at a 15-year-old girl in a funeral yard, the man who had said I told you Maren on the phone at 11 o'clock at night while his daughter sat alone in a kitchen with a cracked injector line and a broken heart. He had driven up from Breckinridge County that morning. Maren did not know he was there. She did not find out until afterward when someone showed her a video taken from the grandstands on a phone. But here is what I learned later. Not from Maren. From her cousin who was standing about 20 feet from Virgil and who saw everything I am about to tell you. Virgil Dawson arrived at the Shelby County Fairgrounds at noon, 4.5 hours before the pull. He parked his truck in the gravel lot and he walked to the track. He walked the entire length of it 300 feet slowly, looking at the dirt, looking at the grandstands, looking at the sky. Then he walked to the staging area where the trucks were lined up. He stopped at the Peterbilt. He put his hand on the fender, the same fender he had told Maren to sell for scrap 16 years ago in a funeral yard full of relatives who nodded along. The same fender that had been rusting in a barn for over a decade while his daughter rebuilt the engine behind it with hand tools and a printout and a kind of determination that he had mistaken for foolishness because it was easier to call it foolishness than to admit that his daughter had inherited something from her grandfather that had skipped him entirely. He stood there with his hand on that fender for about a minute. He did not move. He did not look around. He just stood there, palm flat against the rust, the way Maren had stood with her palm flat against the valve cover that morning in 2015 when she decided to begin. And if you had been standing close enough to see his face, you would have seen something working behind his eyes. Something that had been locked up for a very long time trying to find its way out. Then he walked to the fence line, and he waited. 4.5 hours in the July sun, standing, without sitting down, without getting water, without talking to anyone. He stood at the fence with his hands on the top rail, and he watched every pull that happened before Maren's. He watched Colby Griggs pull 267 feet. He watched the crowd cheer. And he stood there. And when the Peterbilt rolled to the line and the starter ground and the crowd laughed, Virgil Dawson did not laugh. And when the Cummins caught and the turbo began to whistle and the laughter died, he did not cheer. And when Maren pulled that sled foot by foot down the track past 100 feet, past 200, past 267, past 280, past 290 to 300, full pull flag down air horn, and 4,000 people erupted around him. Virgil Dawson stood at the fence line with both hands on the top rail and his head down. He was not cheering, he was not recording it on his phone, he was not pumping his fist, he was just standing there holding the fence with his head bowed. And if you watch the video closely, if you look past the blurred crowd and the waving hands and the phones held high, if you look all the way to the fence line at the far edge of the frame, you can see a man in a gray t-shirt and a John Deere cap, and his shoulders are shaking. I have watched that video enough times to be certain of what I saw. And what I saw was a 63-year-old man standing at a fence in the sun watching his daughter do the thing he told her she could not do, with a truck he told her to throw away, and he could not hold himself together. Not because he was angry, not because he was embarrassed, because he was standing at the intersection of pride and shame, and those two things were hitting him at the same time with equal force. And a man cannot stand at that intersection without breaking at least a little, at least for a moment, at least enough for his shoulders to shake in a way that a phone camera 30 yards away can pick up. Virgil Dawson never said he was sorry. Not that day, not the next week, not the next month. If you are waiting for the scene where the father finds the daughter and wraps his arms around her and says the words that scene did not happen, that is not how it works in families like this. That is not how it works with men like Virgil. The language they were raised with does not have a word for sorry that they know how to pronounce. But in November of 2019, 4 months after Shelby County, Maren came home from work and found something sitting on the porch of her house. It was a toolbox, a snap-on top chest, cherry red, older than she was, with 3 drawers and a piano hinge, and the kind of weight that tells you every tool inside it was bought one at a time by a man who could not afford to buy them all at once. On the left side of the chest, scratched into the red paint with something sharp, maybe a nail, maybe a screwdriver tip, were 2 letters. C.D. Clayton Dawson, Maren's grandfather. The man who had driven the Peterbilt for 22 years and parked it in the barn and said he would get back to it and never did. That toolbox had been in Virgil's garage for 16 years, since the day Clayton died. Virgil had never offered it to anyone. He had never mentioned it. He had never opened it in front of another person. He had kept it the way a man keeps a thing he cannot look at, without feeling something he does not want to feel, but cannot throw away. Because throwing it away would mean admitting that the feeling was there in the first place. 16 years, in a garage, under a workbench, covered in dust, waiting. There was no note, no card, no letter, just the toolbox on the porch and the evening light coming through the trees and rooks sniffing at the hinges. Maren called her father that evening. The conversation lasted about 10 seconds. She said, "I got the toolbox." He said it was his, should be yours. And that was it. That was everything. That was the apology and the admission and the pride and the regret, all compressed into 8 words and a 10-second phone call, because some men can only say the biggest things in the smallest possible space. Maren never talked about that publicly. When I asked her about it, she went quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, "He came. That is what matters. He came." Now let me tell you about Colby Griggs, because what he did after the pull says more about him than any trophy he ever won. After the event, after the scores were posted and the crowd had thinned and the track crew was grading the clay with a tractor and a box blade, Colby walked over to the Peterbilt. Maren was leaning against the front bumper drinking a bottle of water. The engine was still ticking as it cooled, that slow metallic metronome that hot iron plays as it gives its heat back to the air. Colby did not say anything at first. He stood in front of the truck and looked at it. He looked at the rust. He looked at the exhaust stack that was still radiating heat. He looked at the hood where no paint had been for years. Then he spoke. "What size turbo is that?" Maren told him. "How much boost?" 42. He was quiet for a second. He was doing math in his head. How much torque? 2100. Colby stared at the engine bay for a long time. You could see him working through it. The compression ratio, the displacement, the boost pressure, the fuel delivery, all of the numbers adding up to a conclusion that he had not considered before that afternoon, and that was now rearranging everything he thought he knew about pulling. Then he looked at Maren and said, "I brought a knife to a gunfight, did I not?" Maren almost smiled. Almost. The corner of her mouth moved about 1/8 of an inch. She said, "You brought a fast knife. I brought a slow gun. That line. You brought a fast knife. I brought a slow gun. It made the rounds. People printed it on t-shirts. Someone welded it onto a piece of steel plate and bolted it to a fence post outside the Shelby County Fairgrounds entrance, and as far as I know, it is still there, rusting gently in the Kentucky weather, which seems appropriate. But here is the part most people do not know. 3 weeks after Shelby County Colby Griggs drove to Hardinsburg, he did not call ahead, he did not text. He just showed up at the barn on a Tuesday afternoon in his personal truck, not the Aerotech rig, just a regular Chevy Silverado with mud on the fenders and a crack in the windshield. He knocked on the barn door and asked Maren if she would show him the engine. She showed him. Colby spent 2 hours in that barn. He asked questions, he took notes on his phone, he measured things with a tape measure he had brought in his back pocket. He got down on a creeper and slid under the truck and looked at the exhaust routing and the turbo oil drain line and the intercooler piping and the way Maren had fabricated the adapter plate between the HX80 and the exhaust manifold. He stayed under there for 20 minutes. When he came out, he was covered in dust and cobwebs, and there was a streak of old grease across his forehead. He stood up slowly. He looked at the engine from above. He looked at the turbo. He looked at the intake manifold that Maren had built from scratch at Beth Cawley's welding shop with a MIG welder she had not known how to use 2 years earlier. And he said something that Maren repeated to me word for word because she said she would never forget it as long as she lived. He said, "I have been in pulling my whole life. My dad builds these trucks. I have had the best motors money can buy. And I have never seen someone build an engine this smart in a barn with hand tools. You did not just beat me, you solved a problem I did not know existed." Maren looked at him. She did not say thank you. She did not say it was nothing. She nodded once the way Clayton used to nod when someone complimented his truck, acknowledging the words without needing them. Colby Griggs and Maren Dawson are not friends exactly. They do not call each other, they do not text, but when they are at the same event, which happens 2 or 3 times a season, he nods at her across the staging area and she nods back. And there is something in that nod, something that lives in the space between respect and recognition, something that means more than a trophy or a title or a check. Maren pulled at 6 more events that season. She won 4 of them. Full pulls every one. She lost 2 both times to trucks that had been specifically modified after word got around about the Cummins NTC and the Holset HX80, and the woman from Breckinridge County who was making 2,100 foot-pounds of torque from an engine older than most of the drivers she was competing against. She did not mind the losses. She told me they had to change to beat me. I did not have to change to beat them. And there was a quietness in the way she said it that told you everything about who she was. She was not boasting. She was just stating a fact the way her grandfather would have stated a fact, without ornament, without apology. By the end of 2019, 3 different pulling teams had contacted Maren about building engines for them. She turned them all down. She said, "I am not a shop. I am a person with a barn and 1 truck." And that was the end of the conversation. But she did start posting videos. Short clips shot on her phone, no editing, no music, no filters, no titles, just the barn and the engine in her hands. She posted a video showing how she set the valve lash on the NTC. She posted a video showing how she checked the injector pop pressure with a hand pump and a gauge. She posted a video showing how she adjusted the rack on the fuel injection pump using a dial indicator and a steady hand, and the kind of patience that cannot be taught in a classroom. Those videos found an audience, a specific audience, not the pulling crowd though some of them watched, not the diesel mechanics though many of them watched, and more than a few left comments that started with, "I have been working on these engines for 30 years and never thought to do it that way." The audience that found those videos, the audience that watched them over and over and saved them and sent them to friends and sisters and daughters was women. Women in rural counties who worked with their hands. Women who had been told one way or another by a father or a boss or a husband or a stranger at a parts counter that what they were doing was not for them. Maren never made a speech about it. She never went on a podcast and talked about what it meant. She never said the words representation or empowerment or breaking barriers or any of the words that people in offices and on stages and behind microphones used to describe what she was doing. She never positioned herself as a symbol or a movement or a cause. She never gave an interview where she said the thing you are supposed to say. She just showed the work. The greasy, difficult, frustrating, beautiful, lonely, unglamorous work of keeping a 45-year-old engine alive and making it do things its designers at Cummins in Columbus, Indiana in 1968 never imagined it could do. She showed the burned fingers and the split knuckles and the hours on the barn floor with a creeper and a trouble light. She showed what it looks like when a person cares about something enough to be bad at it for a long time before they are good at it. That is what mattered, not the words, the work. The Peterbilt still is not painted. It still looks like something you would find in a field behind a gas station that closed in 1997. Maren says she will paint it when she is done with it, and she is not done with it. The Cummins NTC, or whatever you call it now, that it is making 812 horsepower from an engine that was rated at 350 when it left the factory, turns over every morning the way it has since she rebuilt it in that barn. The turbo still whistles, the exhaust still thumps, the rust still sits on the hood like a coat that has been there so long it belongs. Clayton Dawson's toolbox sits in the barn now. Cherry red 3-drawers piano hinge, CD scratched into the left side. Maren keeps her feeler gauges in the top drawer. The same feeler gauges that were Clayton's that she used to set the valve lash at 14 thousandths on the intake and 27 thousandths on the exhaust that her hands have worn smooth in the same places his hands wore them smooth 30 years before her. Next to the feeler gauges is a binder clip, the one that held the 237-page manual together. Maren does not need the manual anymore. She has not needed it for over a year. But the binder clip stays in the drawer because it was there at the beginning and the beginning matters. Otis Henley's bucket is still in the corner of the barn. Maren has never moved it. She never will. Some mornings when the light comes through the barn door at a certain angle and hits the bucket at a certain slant, she can almost see him sitting there, almost hear the thermos cap unscrewing, almost smell that terrible coffee, almost hear his voice saying 2.997 is fine, do not chase a number that does not matter. The toolbox sits on a shelf that Maren built from the same oak that the crossbeam is made of, the beam that held the engine, the beam that did not break. There is a photograph from that day at Shelby County. You may have seen it. It shows Maren standing next to the Peterbilt in lane 1, one hand on her hip, sunlight on the rust, and Colby Griggs standing next to his Aerotech machine in lane 2, arms crossed, sunglasses on. Between them the starting lights. Behind them the blur of 4,000 people. If you did not know the story, you would think you were looking at a mismatch. You would think you were looking at a woman who was about to be humiliated. That is the thing about looking at the outside of something. You see the rust, you see the boots, you see the cowboy hat and the old truck and the woman who weighs 130 pounds, and you think you know the whole story. You think you know what is under the hood. You think you know what is going to happen next. And then the turbo spools, and then the ground shakes. And then you realize you were wrong about everything you thought you knew. Now I have told you Maren's story, and I want to hear yours. How old are you? What city are you in? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And while you are down there, tell me this. What is the thing that people looked at you and thought they had you figured out? What is the thing they laughed at before they knew what was under your hood? Because everybody has got one. Everybody has got a rusted Peterbilt sitting in a barn somewhere. Something they have been working on quietly. Something they believe in when no one else does. Something the world has not seen yet. Tell me about yours. And if this story hit you the way it hit the people standing in those grandstands that Saturday in July, if you felt the ground shake under your feet, if something in your chest tightened when Virgil put his hand on the fender, or when Maren opened that toolbox on the porch, then share it with someone who needs to feel it too. Share it with someone who has been working on something alone. Share it with someone who has been laughed at. Share it with someone whose father never said the right words at the right time. That is all I ask. Stories like this do not survive unless somebody passes them on. That Peterbilt is still out there. The turbo still whistles. And Maren Cade Dawson still does not explain herself to anyone. Some engines just speak for themselves.